For decades, the World Cup felt simple. Not easy, not perfect, but simple. Every 4 years, football stopped belonging to clubs. It stopped belonging to sponsors. It stopped belonging to billion-dollar corporations. And for 1 month, it belonged to the world. Fans traveled across continents. Nations carried dreams. Unknown players became heroes. And somehow, despite all the politics and all the money surrounding modern football, the World Cup still felt like football's purest stage. But as World Cup 2026 begins, something feels different. Not because the football is bad. In fact, the football has already produced moments worth celebrating. Goals have been scored. Stories have started. Dreams are alive. Yet somehow the conversation keeps returning to everything except the football, the people who couldn't get in, the fans who couldn't travel, the officials who were turned away, the empty seats, the heat, the prices, the sponsorships, and the growing feeling among many supporters that the tournament they grew up loving is slowly becoming something else. So here's the question. Is World Cup 2026 simply going through early tournament problems? Or are we watching the beginning of something much bigger? The possibility that this is the last World Cup that still resembles the one football fans grew up with. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Do you think World Cup 2026 is improving football? Or do you think FIFA is taking the tournament in the wrong direction? Let me know in the comments, because by the end of this video, I think a lot of people will have strong opinions. Now, let's start with the issue that has defined the opening days of this tournament more than any goal, any player, or any result. Access. Because football's biggest tournament has somehow become a tournament many people cannot access. A professor of sport recently described World Cup 2026 with 2 words: World Cup of exclusion. And whether you agree with that phrase or not, it's becoming increasingly difficult to ignore why people are using it. The most shocking example involved a man who wasn't even a fan. He wasn't a journalist. He wasn't a tourist. He was a FIFA official. Omar Abdelkader Artan, one of Africa's most respected referees, named the continent's best male referee, selected by FIFA itself to officiate at the World Cup, a historic achievement. The first Somali referee ever chosen for football's biggest tournament. He arrived in Miami and was denied entry. Think about that. A referee selected by FIFA, carrying FIFA credentials, traveling to a FIFA World Cup, unable to enter the host nation. The incident immediately became one of the defining stories of the tournament, not because of football, but because of what it revealed. FIFA had spent years promoting this World Cup as a global celebration, a tournament for the world, yet one of its own officials couldn't even reach it. And that wasn't the end of the story, because Artan wasn't alone. Iranian team staff faced entry difficulties. Accredited journalists struggled with visa complications. Supporters from multiple countries reported problems obtaining travel access. Several nations participating in the tournament found themselves navigating restrictions that other nations simply didn't face. For some teams, World Cup preparation stopped being about football. It became about paperwork, borders, approvals, and uncertainty. One of the most extraordinary examples involved Iran. Rather than freely preparing in the United States like many other teams, reports indicated the squad would effectively operate from Mexico and cross the border around match days. Imagine preparing for the biggest football tournament on earth under those circumstances. And here's where things became even more controversial. Every time a new case emerged, FIFA's response remained almost identical. The organization repeatedly stated that it was not involved in the immigration processes of host countries, and that entry decisions ultimately belonged to national governments. Legally, that statement is true, but for many supporters, it felt incomplete, because while FIFA doesn't control immigration policy, FIFA did choose the hosts. FIFA did design the tournament. FIFA did promise a World Cup open to the world. And when problems emerged, many fans expected more than a statement. They expected leadership. That's why criticism started growing across football. Former players spoke out. Media organizations questioned the planning. And perhaps most significantly, respected football voices across Europe began asking uncomfortable questions about accountability. Because the concern wasn't only about one referee, or one visa, or one nation. The concern was bigger. If the World Cup cannot guarantee access for the people participating in it, what exactly does global tournament mean? And that's where the story starts becoming uncomfortable. Because while supporters were debating visas and border controls, another problem was becoming impossible to ignore. The stadiums. Not all of them. Not everywhere. But enough to create a conversation. Enough to create headlines. Enough to create doubt. Several opening matches produced images that immediately spread across social media. Rows of empty seats. Large visible gaps, and fans asking the same question. Why are there empty seats at the biggest World Cup in history? Official attendance figures often appeared healthy, but television pictures told a more complicated story. And that's where another uncomfortable question emerged. Had football become too expensive for its own supporters? Because months before the tournament began, fans were already complaining about pricing. Tickets, accommodation, travel costs. Everything seemed higher than ever before. For many supporters, attending this World Cup wasn't simply difficult. It was becoming impossible. And unlike previous tournaments, last-minute ticket releases couldn't solve the problem. Because World Cup trips aren't planned in a week. They're planned in months, sometimes years, which meant every empty seat was becoming a symbol, a reminder of a growing gap between football's governing bodies and football supporters. And the irony was difficult to ignore. This was supposed to be the biggest World Cup ever. More teams, more matches, more revenue, more exposure. Yet many supporters felt further away from the tournament than ever before. And that raises an even bigger question. Because if fans are struggling to enter the country, if supporters are being priced out, if stadiums aren't consistently full, then who exactly is this new World Cup being built for? And that is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because once you start following the money, the heat, and the commercial decisions surrounding this tournament, you begin to understand why some fans believe football's biggest celebration is slowly becoming something else entirely. So if access was becoming a problem, and affordability was becoming a problem, then the next question was inevitable. What exactly was FIFA trying to build? Because when you look closely at World Cup 2026, one number keeps appearing over and over again. Revenue, not goals, not supporters, not football. Revenue. And that's where many fans believe the tournament started changing. For decades, FIFA defended expansion by arguing that a bigger World Cup would help football grow. More teams, more nations, more opportunities. And to be fair, there is truth in that argument. Countries that rarely had a realistic chance of reaching a World Cup are now here. New football cultures are being represented. New stories are being created. That part is undeniably positive. But every decision creates consequences. And many supporters are starting to wonder whether football growth is the only reason behind these changes. Because World Cup 2026 isn't just bigger. It's dramatically bigger. More teams, more matches, more stadiums. More tickets, more sponsorship opportunities, more broadcasting inventory, more advertising inventory, more everything. And with every additional match comes additional money. A lot of money. Reports surrounding the tournament estimate revenue projections unlike anything football has ever seen before. And that raises a difficult question. When FIFA expands a tournament, who benefits most? The game or the business around the game? Because many supporters increasingly feel those two things are no longer perfectly aligned. And nowhere is that tension more visible than in one of the strangest controversies of the tournament, the hydration breaks. Now, on the surface, hydration breaks sound completely reasonable. Temperatures in several host cities have been extreme. Players have openly expressed concerns. Medical experts have expressed concerns. Sports scientists have expressed concerns. This isn't speculation. It's reality. Players are competing in conditions that can become physically dangerous. So additional hydration breaks make sense. In fact, many would argue they are necessary. But here's where the criticism begins. Because those hydration breaks are also advertising opportunities. Think about that for a second. A health measure, a player welfare measure, a moment designed to protect athletes, also becomes commercial inventory. Also becomes advertising space. And suddenly the question isn't about hydration anymore. It's about priorities. Because supporters see these decisions and start asking themselves whether every aspect of the tournament is now being viewed through a commercial lens. And honestly, it's difficult to blame them. The modern World Cup exists inside a commercial ecosystem unlike anything previous generations experienced. Sponsors, broadcasters, advertising campaigns, corporate partnerships, revenue targets. Every major sporting event has these things. But many supporters feel World Cup 2026 has pushed them closer to the center of the experience than ever before. And when supporters start noticing the business more than the football, that's usually a warning sign. But even that wasn't the biggest concern, because another issue had been quietly growing throughout the tournament: the heat. And unlike ticket prices or sponsorships, heat isn't a public relations problem. It's a player welfare problem. Long before the tournament started, researchers and sports scientists warned about conditions in certain host cities. Warnings were issued. Concerns were raised. Studies were published. The concern was simple: can players perform safely in these conditions? And perhaps more importantly, should they have to? Because football at the highest level already pushes players to physical limits. Now add extreme summer temperatures. Add travel. Add recovery demands. Add World Cup pressure. And suddenly the challenge becomes even greater. The irony is difficult to ignore. One of the major talking points before Qatar 2022 was climate, heat, player welfare, scheduling. Yet some experts warned that parts of World Cup 2026 could create similar concerns despite entirely different geography. And that's why many players called for stronger protections before the tournament even began. The concern wasn't whether football could be played. Of course it could. The concern was whether football should be played under certain conditions. And as the tournament continues, that question is unlikely to disappear. But perhaps the most revealing story of all came from England, not because it was the most serious controversy, and not because it changed the tournament, but because it perfectly captured how strange this World Cup has become. Just days before England's opening match, equipment belonging to the national team disappeared during transit in the United States. Harry Kane's boots, Jude Bellingham's equipment, Thomas Tuchel's tactical materials, items essential to preparation for the biggest tournament in football. The incident became a police matter, and while England eventually managed the disruption professionally, the story became symbolic because it joined a growing list of strange headlines surrounding this World Cup: visa problems, entry denials, ticket controversies, fraud warnings, accommodation scams, missing equipment, heat concerns, empty seats. Individually, each issue can be explained. Individually, each issue may seem manageable. But together they create a picture. And that picture is what many supporters are reacting to. Because football fans are remarkably tolerant. They understand tournaments are complicated. They understand mistakes happen. They understand no World Cup will ever be perfect. But they also understand what the World Cup is supposed to feel like. And that's where the concern comes from. The feeling, not necessarily the results, not necessarily the football, the feeling that the tournament is becoming harder to access, harder to attend, harder to afford, harder to recognize. That's why this conversation matters. Because despite everything we've discussed, the football itself still works. Japan are creating stories. Morocco are creating stories. Argentina are creating stories. France are creating stories. The game itself continues doing what it has always done: creating moments, creating memories, creating heroes. Football hasn't failed. The players haven't failed. The supporters certainly haven't failed. The question many people are asking is whether the institutions around football are beginning to lose sight of what made the World Cup special in the first place. Because the World Cup was never supposed to be defined by visas, or pricing structures, or legal investigations, or commercial saturation. It was supposed to be defined by people. The supporter who saved for years to attend one match. The referee achieving a lifelong dream. The journalist traveling across the world to tell stories. The family making memories together in a stadium. Those people are the World Cup, not the sponsors, not the executives, not the revenue projections. And that's why some supporters look at World Cup 2026 and ask a question that would have sounded unthinkable a decade ago. Has football's biggest tournament become too big for its own good? Maybe the answer is no. Maybe once the knockout rounds begin, the football will overwhelm every controversy. Maybe the goals, the drama, and the unforgettable moments will become the only story anyone remembers. World Cups have a habit of doing that. But maybe the concerns won't disappear. Maybe the empty seats, the entry denials, the heat, the pricing, and the commercial saturation aren't isolated problems. Maybe they're symptoms of something larger. A tournament growing faster than its connection to the people who made it meaningful. And that's why this World Cup feels different. Not because it's the biggest, not because it's the most expensive, not because it's the most ambitious, but because for the first time, many supporters are wondering whether football's greatest tournament is slowly becoming something else. The football will always survive. The football always does. The real question is whether the people running the game still understand why the World Cup mattered in the first place. And if they don't, then World Cup 2026 may not be remembered as the beginning of a new era. It may be remembered as the moment football fans realized the World Cup they grew up loving was starting to disappear.